Hey everyone, and welcome to another recording of Our Human Experience, the podcast where we probe individuals to share the stories that made them who they are today.
And try to find the connection that is our human experience. And we are recording today in beautiful Govinda at the Arts Nexus podcast studio. I'm Claire Tierney.
And I'm Anna Winter.
Where can they follow us, Anna?
They can follow us on social media at Our Human Experience on Instagram and Facebook.
ourhumanexperience.com.au. We invite you
to pod binge
Our Human Experience
anytime you like.
Hello, Anna.
Good morning, Claire.
How are you today?
I'm really well.
Did you have a good week?
I had a fantastic week. The wet season started, so...
Oh, you like the rain.
I do. We actually don't call it rain here. We call it turning the tap on.
Don't we?
Because it has a different sound. It goes... shh.
It's pretty powerful when it hits.
And
I always think it's a bit like a bucket has just sort of been turned upside down.
Incredible. And I think... not growing up in North Queensland and being from down south like yourself will bring us over to our next guest this morning.
And talking going south, I'm going back south.
You are going south.
So soon. I'm going back what I would say going home, but at the same time this has been my home for 20 years.
Yeah.
But my son and I are going back south. So we're coming down to speak to this new lady that we're talking to today.
Yeah. So let's bring our next guest on.
Lovely.
So I'd like to introduce to our listeners Jane Cafarella.
Hello, Jane.
Hi, Anna. Hi, Claire. Lovely to see you both.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today. Jane, there's a lot of people who grew up in Victoria would have read a lot of your articles over the years if they are readers of the Age newspaper. But we like to start this process right back where it all sort of began. So we ask all of our guests to go back to those early formative years, the 0 to 5 or the 0 to 15, when we formulated who we are, and then we like to know a little bit about where you grew up, where you're placed in your family, and some of the things that happened to you in those times.
Okay, then. My father was born in Australia of Sicilian parents who arrived here in the 1920s. And he was the youngest boy. He was the third child, and he was bullied and called a wog as a child, and he was also bullied by his father. So in an act of rebellion, he married my mother, who was Australian, not Catholic, and 5 years older. And and she married him in an act of rebellion too, because she had trained as an opera singer, and she was invited by Thorold Waters, who was the Herald Sun music critic at the time, responsible for the Herald Sun aria, the Sun aria. Anyway, and he invited her to Covent Garden, at least this is her story. And her parents wouldn't allow her to go because her brother had died in the war, her sister was married, and they were clinging onto her. And so she said she married him as an act of rebellion. And it was a very unhappy union, made more unhappy by the fact that he went bankrupt when I was 4. He was involved with a dodgy businessman called Perry, and who went to jail for fraud. And so that sort of put another pall on things. But the most significant thing, I think, was my sister and I were 14 months apart, and each of us was claimed by a parent in the war against each other. So I was my mother's, and my sister Julia, she was known then, was my father's. And I was the good girl, and she was the bad girl. And so...
difficult times.
Yeah, so that was, and we moved around a lot because of the bankruptcy, and so my early years up to the age of 16 were like that, and then my parents separated, and I went with my mother, and my sister went with my father, and then an event happened that made the emotional divide physical, because my father then went off with my mother's sister. So this is a whole story of envy and, relationships between sisters, and she was widowed. And so that meant the emotional divide was physical, and I didn't see my sister again except for when her baby was born once very briefly for 20 years. And then I didn't reunite with my cousins from that side of the family for 40 years.
Wow.
So that that was really the sort of the catalyst for a lot of other things in my life. And so, yeah.
It's an interesting thread, Jane, that those formative years, and that's why we begin our human experience with everyone individually at this time, because as we grow into, I won't say to our older years, because I'm adulthood, we'll say, we can recognize things that have happened to us in our childhood that we're either drawn to or that can particularly we can sort of go, well, I'm reacting in that way because of this experience potentially in childhood, or that's maybe the pathway that I went along because of the direction I was pulled in or not pulled in, if that makes sense. So,
well, yeah, you're lucky if you have that awareness and intuition to understand that, and that's part of maturing. And hopefully, we all have that and can sort of learn from those experiences about the patterns that follow.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that brings the question of that closeness as a single child with your mum.
Yes.
And the first thing that we sort of noticed when you came on camera was that there was a musical instrument behind you. And, and the discussion off camera sort of started with that. So I'm thinking there you were the good girl. So why do we all have labels or can say in family. So can you explain that good girl at that age? You were good, your mum said, and you did. Is that kind of how it worked, or?
Yes, I mean, it was more than that. My sister was demonized and I was fated. And so it took me a long time to sort of realize that I had a lot of illnesses, and that threw my mother and I together much more. And I was a compliant child and she was rebellious. And so easy one. Yeah. And I think I felt a lot of empathy for my mother. She was ill a lot of the time. She had no money. She was stuck. And I was sort of, that strong empathy drew us together more too. And so, but my sister rebelled against everything. And so it was, I observed this, and I was sort of like an observer in the family. I think that's probably why I became a journalist, because sort of it's an extension of that role of observing others without participating. So it's taken me a long time to understand all this. At the time, I didn't realize it. So it was all the sort of illnesses as well that sort of put my mother and I together. I just basically didn't question things, and I was sort of reflecting her, that sort of mirroring that children do, compliant children do. So, and it was a complicated relationship, and it was a mirroring too of the complicated relationship she had with her sister. And I think she sort of projected that onto my sister and I as well. And the fact that my father was a lot younger too, and he was young in the head as well. But they were, at the same time, they were both musical. Music brought them together. And while we had this sort of strange dissonance between the Italian side of the family too and my mother's family, where we were aligned with the Australian side, my mother and father did have these moments of harmony because they sang and played together. And he played guitar. The whole Italian family played something. And my Aunt Tess loves to say that they all played something badly. But musicians are in our family. My son is a fantastic composer, and my daughter is a wonderful singer. So and I have a cousin who's an opera singer very successfully. So we do some things well. So they played and sang folk songs, Joan Baez's songs, and Nina and Frederick and Harry Belafonte. And that was a moment of harmony for us, and something really special. And that was very big on the Italian side of the family. But we had this sort of dissonance with the Italian side of the family because my sister and I didn't understand the dialect. We didn't speak Italian at the family dues. We didn't have PhDs. We weren't Catholics. We didn't go to Catholic schools and stuff. So we sort of grew up in Mentone initially from when I was 4. And I always felt that we were fake Italians and fake Italy, because Mentone is fake Italy, because It's many of the main streets are named after the Riviera, because it was named after Menton on the Riviera, the cusp of Italy and France. And the idea was that the founding fathers thought that it would be a sort of a beachside resort that would attract the rich and famous. So we lived in Remo Street. Our grandmother lived in Florence Street. We went down Brindisi Street. But we were sort of, people would ask me over the years, oh, Cafarella, you're Italian. But I didn't feel Italian. I looked, but I didn't feel it because we had that dissonance. Yeah. So the music was something that actually was something that brought my sister and I together at the same time and brought the family together. So that was the sort of highlight. And that's, I guess, why I've maintained that through my husband plays guitar. He's a fantastic blues guitarist, and everybody plays something, but not badly.
It's really lovely for you, I guess, that you did have those moments of harmony, and that way you could actually find so much joy in music, because music isn't specifically this culture or that culture. It can just really combine us together. So I'm really glad for you, actually, that you could find that joy in the music. What I wanted to ask you about was, when you say you were an observer as a child, did you read a lot, write a lot? What did you do as a single child? And maybe how that, being the single child as the observer, lead us into the journalism, and how you may have come at that. Even though I was my mother's, we grew up in the same household until I was 16. But throughout that time, and particularly after that, after the separation, I was always a writer. I always wrote, I think, to make sense of things. I didn't keep diaries or journals, except when I was 15, 16, the year my parents separated, I kept a diary. And so that's quite illuminating now. And I didn't realise, I would never show my daughter, I was completely boy mad. It's so embarrassing reading it back. I thought I was a good girl, and I thought, oh my God, really? Anyway, so in terms of writing, I've always written. I read early because I was sick a lot, so I read before I went to school. And I often, throughout the years, as this drama evolved, I often wrote down conversations because I was trying to make sense of them. So afterwards, I would sort of write down what happened. So writing was something that I always did, and my mother encouraged that, although never to write about her.
Well, is this something they've said, Jane? Why were you sick?
Oh, I was very premature. She had Rh negative blood. In those days, there was injection, and so her blood made antibodies that poisoned my sister and I, and so we were both transfused, but I was very premature. 6 weeks was a long time in those days. And so I was very small, and so that sort of pushed us together much more. And then later on, I developed lymphedema. I don't know if you know that. Well, that means when I was a baby, so I was born with one leg bigger than the other. Do you know about lymphedema? Do you know when women have breast cancer, sometimes their arms swell? Yep. That's called lymphedema, but it wasn't very well known in those days. And so what happens is the lymphatic system fails and the swelling doesn't go down. What they didn't know in those days was it was progressive, but in those days they didn't. And then even today, very little is known about lymphedema. I mean, it's a really important system in the lymphatic system. It fights infection, it helps your immune system, it gets rid of all the sort of waste and everything. But I think there's the GPs spend about 45 minutes on it and all their training, and there's a lot of ignorance. So there was ignorance in those days, and I also, because of the prematurity, I developed petit mal when I was 5, which is like a childhood version of epilepsy. Really? So these things, I spent a lot of time with my mother at the Royal Children's Hospital. And so that sort of threw us together as well.
So within you saying that, Jane, spending time in hospital, not being able to get around as a child, that must have heightened, I'm just thinking, hearing this, heightened your sensitivities to your surroundings, because if you were unwell, you become, your sensories, I would assume, would become so much more aware of what's going on around you, like because of what was going on with you personally. Is that right?
Yeah. But I wasn't in hospital as an inpatient. I was an outpatient visiting to have regular EEGs, like to test your brain waves and things. And it was not a disability, more or less, it was a deformity, which was, so I did have sort of little seizures, but petit mal is more an absence where you just go blank, sort of like the senior moments I have now. and you're in another little world. And I did have seizures as well, that when they were trying to regulate it as well. So I remember those very vividly, like falling off chairs and falling down and stuff, which meant I couldn't have a bike. But I was a sturdy child. I was not a sickly child. And I still did everything that every other child did apart from ride a bike, because my mother just ignored it. You know, it was ignored. It was something that was never spoken about. It was never referred to, except when I went to the Children's Hospital for petit mal, and then the doctor would sort of say, "How's the leg?" And they go, "Same," and that would be it. You know, so it was not. And in many ways, I think my mother did me a favour, because she didn't make me a victim, and I had many operations. When I was 18, she found a plastic surgeon that could do reductions. And I had many operations over the years to reduce it, and that was sort of also, there were many changes in my life happening at that time, so it was sort of became a metaphor for all the changes that were happening emotionally as well as physically. So you know, it's never resolved, because lymphedema is progressive, and it gets bigger and bigger unless you have these reduction operations, which are not fashionable now. Now they do lymphatic massage, which is less invasive. So that was dealt with in a way, with many things were dealt with in those days, which was to ignore it. But I guess the internalization and the observation that I developed was because I had to deal with that myself, school and wherever I went. That was my problem. And in fact, the diary I have is really revealing, because I didn't discuss any of this with my mother, or all the things, or my sort of fears regarding boys and school and things. That was just a personal thing that I dealt with on my own.
Wow. You're very resilient from such a young age, because, you know, having that type of, like you said, things weren't spoken about, so you were internalizing.
Yes.
So do you think that's why you were drawn to journalism? Like, so you could actually put a lot of that down on paper?
I think I came from a family of storytellers. They love to mythologize, and had many great family stories. And I think being an observer and just an absorber of things, it really was the perfect career for me, because I was also an empathetic person. So, and that meant that I was a good listener. But I wasn't a traditional journalist. I never count myself in the sort of typical journalist, ambulance chasing, politically aware sort of. I mean, I did it as a feminist journalist working for Accent, but I was more of a writer, I think, than a journalist. And I've never won anything. And in fact, I have a story on my website called "Why I've Never Won a Walkley." So
I have to sort of say in this conversation that that we know each other through my mother, Jan, through writing, and for quite some time. And you're a woman of many talents that keeps reformulating in the arts world, can I say? But the one moment I have with you that sits in my education in year 7 was being dyslexic, which, as you can imagine, for Jan Pierce was very difficult as a child, because I struggled with my reading and writing. But the one project that I actually enjoyed doing was of some poems. And in year 7, those poems were sent to you. And I don't remember how because we didn't have email back then. But you actually did some cartoons for my poems for my year 7 project, which I still have treasured.
Oh, thank you.
And that brings me onto the topic of how creative you are with drawing also, and expression, and also some comedy thrown into that.
Yes, I think, well, I mean, my father was very creative and he drew. He drew on everything. He drew on the frontispieces of my books, on our Laminex table, on everything. And he was a very good artist. But when I was 9, I had the mumps, and a neighbour gave us a great big box of Disney comics, and I copied those, and it sort of went from there. But I'm not an artist. I say I'm not a still life with fruit. I couldn't draw anything real. For me, it's mostly the gag that counts. The drawings are very good, and I'm too patient and it's too quick. But it's been a great tool. It's sort of an extension of the writing, and I think sort of for me, it's more that whether it's a song, a poem, or play, you have an idea and you have to decide what it needs to be. Is it a story? Is it a piece of journalism? Is it a poem? Is it a cartoon? Or is it a song or a play? So it's sort of, I don't limit myself to one thing. So I just try a little bit of everything. So the cartoons were a part of that, and were encouraged very much by Murray Smith, my first editor at Standard News, and also by Rosemary West at The Age, and it just became a fun extra thing.
So I wanted to ask you also, I mean, actually I'll go back a little way. I understand that process of coming through illness, coming through the phases that the illness knowledge base comes with you. So when I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, they basically said, oh, you're really well, you're really fit, nothing going on much right at the moment. Come back if something goes wrong. Now, I know these days they've got a very different approach, but they did not know anything about diet or meditation, or they never talked about anything that could possibly help other than a drug that they wanted me to go on, but not right now. So
how old were you how old are you, Claire?
I was 28 and I'm 54 now. So,
wow.
It was a progress, though. That's kind of my reflection. And it's kind of fascinating when you look back at your own life and you realise that people that are diagnosed now would get a very different approach to how you deal with that. So the fact that you learned along the way and you dealt as you could, that's very empowering, kind of frustrating at times, but very empowering. I wondered whether that experience has come into any of your writing, whether you've written anything. I mean, don't know, but you know how that has played a part of your observations in your articles in the family, part of The Age, and all of that. So,
well, the irony is that I didn't write about it because I didn't think about it. No. With Accent, when I worked for The Age, I worked for Accent, which was the women's section, which was feminist sort of stories and social issues affecting women. I wrote one story about it for the Year of the Disabled, and even though I didn't identify as disabled at the time, I understood the thing I was objecting to was the notion that disabled people had to be either victims or heroes. Yeah, and so I wrote a passionate article about that. And I wrote once about when I had the column for The Age, I had a column called A New Life Journal, which was about my family, which is embarrassing, but Alan Kohler was trying to raise the women's readership. And so he asked me to write that column, which sort of went on after the first year. And I wrote about introducing my leg to my daughter, because at that stage it was after many operations, there was a lot of scar tissue. It was quite confronting. And she said to me, I don't like your rucky reg.
And you said, I don't like it either.
Oh.
It's an interesting. Kids are always very honest with their responses to things. So
I didn't write about it because I didn't identify with it really. It was parked just as my mother had encouraged me to park it, and people didn't discuss it with me because I didn't discuss it.
sure.
So really sort of, and I wrote once, I think there's 3 articles I wrote when my surgeon died. He was a very famous microsurgeon, and I wrote about that, but that's all.
Okay. So then, if on the back of that, of not writing about the personal side of everything, that what can I go there or investigate what might have been, or if there was a personal side to any of the plays that you've written?
Yes, the plays, the first play was about surrogacy, the relationship between an infertile woman and the surrogate she hires, and this was about commercial surrogacy in America. It was called eBay.
eBay, yeah.
Only really through writing my family story as a memoir, which I'm now immersed in at the moment, that I realised that actually I was writing about loss, because infertility, as you know, there is about loss. And also surrogacy, which is often not recognised, is about loss. So it's really taken the writing of this memoir to really sort of understand why I was attracted to that story. And also the follow-up play, which is called D-Baby, which is about a conceived child searching for her true identity. And so I hadn't really understood what I was searching for. So yes, I think it has come out in ways,
Okay.
I think, Jane, it's, throughout a lot of our conversations we've had on our human experience, there's a lot of things that aren't talked about. And I think the space of surrogacy and IVF and fertility, menopause, perimenopausal, all those lovely things, they're not talked about enough, openly, when, especially with surrogacy, it's complex. And that's, I found that you've gone into that area of writing and expression and that format and how you've produced is a game changer, because for me it is a touchy, and it is a sensitive area, fertility and adoption, all these things, because it all delves down into who we are and our identity.
Yes.
So for me, the feedback, like I've followed you, obviously, on social media, and how you brought that across into fruition, if that makes sense. Can you tell me a little bit about that journey of first of all, the first play?
That journey was a baptism of fire.
I'm sure that's why I asked the question, because I'm sure there's been a lot of opinions as well. But when you speak about something like this, it's going to cause conversation in a good way as well.
Do you want to know about the topic of surrogacy or the experience of producing?
The experience of producing such a sensitive area.
The play, I was really lucky to have submitted a monologue from the play to Melbourne Writers Theatre. And through that, I met Brenda Palmer, who was an actor who had, when I came, I was living in Singapore at the time, and I was back and forth to Melbourne, and she sort of said, we have to kill the journalist and discover the playwright. And she helped me do that, and along with another actor called Carolyn Masson. And through them, their encouragement, I ended up producing it at Chapel of Chapel, where we thought we got a little grant for $3,000 and thought that would be enough. Anyway, we hired a director, and also she hired the crew and everything. And we were lucky that they did a great job and it was critically acclaimed. But I was very naive about the industry, and it's a very difficult industry to be in because of the various egos. And there was conflict during that production, and it was just very, very difficult because I had a public persona as well. And we had the 7:30 report came, and we had a Q&A and everything. And people were very divided about the subject. And so we had people would stay afterwards and debate, because the play was just a gender, two women, the surrogate and the infertile woman, and it divided people. Some people were on Lily's side and some people were on Catherine's side, and they wanted to talk about it afterwards, and it was very emotional. Yeah. So just the experience of producing was just exhausting and very trying, but it was, I'm really glad I did it, because it was picked up by the Ensemble Theatre in Sydney, and then the Tasmanian Theatre Company picked it up in Hobart. For some strange reason, somebody translated it into Turkish. And
Tamil, I read.
E-Baby was translated into Turkish by a translator living in Germany, who was a passionate theatre person and who sort of read it and wanted to translate it. And it's now in the Directorate of Theatres in Istanbul, I think. But I've written to him and said what's happened, but he's never written back. So I don't know what happened there. But yeah, so it went on and was then produced by a student production in Cedarville, Ohio. And then the So-and-So Arts Club in London did a rehearsed reading, and then it was produced by Equitas Theatre Company in London. And then this COVID year, it was going to be produced by a very small company called Talking Horse Productions in Missouri, but that was cancelled due to COVID. And also Les Antonettes in Spain, a theatre group, were going to produce it and tour it to the Catalan states, but that was cancelled too. So we're hoping that maybe, so it did have an extended life, and I'm very grateful to all the people who helped me get started. But certainly my 10 years of being a playwright have been both exciting and traumatic.
Let's throw in some COVID to go with that too.
No doubt. I was going to say, Jane, that as I wouldn't imagine what it was like to be a writer, but I have been a producer for many years, and so they are very extremely different beasts, and production is quite exhausting. So hats off to you for taking on both roles, absolutely, and for taking it that much further that it's gone around the world, even though COVID has put a little stop in its currency at the moment. I'm sure it has got its own legs, because the topics are ever vibrant and emotional and need to be out there. So hats off to you on that one.
Absolutely. And I think, Jane, having that acknowledgement after the performance for a discussion to take place in many ways for the play to continue on is so important, because like a lot of people don't talk about the topic at all. So I think with the changing laws and the way the world is now, that we can't go overseas, that's probably another play in itself.
Yes.
Because I've had many conversations with people that are wanting to find a surrogate, and I've also looked into that myself. But with the way that we can't travel overseas at the moment, it puts a whole other layer across that dream, or that it really isn't a dream. I think when you're wanting to reproduce and you can't do that yourself, you normally, for 9 years of my life, no one could get in my way. And, IVF, coupled with IVF and fertility drugs, I was pretty driven in an emotional manner that was very unhealthy in many ways for myself as a woman, and it came at a cost to my hormone levels. And if I only knew what I knew now, those lovely drugs that I took for many, many years, how that can then change, my 40s and going into my 50s. So there's so many layers to potentially, I don't know, I'm just, of what you potentially are going to do with this topic and where you may take that into the future.
No, I think E-Baby stands on its own, and it does touch on all those issues of the cost cost to both the infertile woman and to the surrogate. And I think writing that, I wanted to highlight that because the surrogate side of the story is particularly unacknowledged in terms of cost to them. But I think I'd like to see it performed elsewhere as well, because it's still something that is not necessarily discussed in the media, which is all pretty much the story of the infertile couple, is the one that is promoted on the media, and the cost to both the child and the surrogate is ignored, mainly because of the industry itself, which promotes it all. So I'm not going to write another play like that, but I would like to see D Baby, which is the further extension of that, which is about donor conception. I'd like to see that play produced. We had a very good rehearsed reading in Melbourne, which went very well, and it's been workshopped in Singapore, in Sydney, and in Hobart, and got to critical acclaim, but we haven't had it produced yet. And I think that's got quite a lot to say in terms of identity for these donor conceived people who often it isn't acknowledged that while the rest of the world is on who do you think you are and sort of exploring their roots, for donor conceived people that's very difficult, and often emotionally difficult to go there, because of course we all love our parents and all grateful to our parents, but with a donor conceived person, it's can have a sense of betrayal when they want to look into where they came from. So it's a very complex area, and that's why D Baby explores that complex identity, and those questions of having to be grateful, and how do you know yourself under those circumstances. So I'd like to see that produced sometime, if anyone's interested.
You never know.
You never know.
Might spend some time up in the tropics, maybe, Jane. Port Douglas.
I would say that we definitely the topic that you're touching on is not just for people who are in the IVF or conceive that way, because there are other people who would relate to this topic, people who maybe have been brought up with single parents who've never known their mother or their father, or whichever way it went. So the topics you're enlightening for us all, as it were, through this play, they're broader than just within the IVF and the test tube world, aren't they? So they touch on that whole thing about identity and how you perceive yourself if you don't know both of your parents.
Yes, and I think for me, I didn't realise that was what I was really exploring, because I have their identity that was really sort of denied me by my mother, not being interested in the Italian side of things except for the food, and also just the sort of the separation I had from my own family for so long. I think that's what I was really identifying with in writing those plays, and just the while the rest of the world seems to be sort of wanting to find out, that there are other people who aren't allowed to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you would have had, obviously, the empathy and understanding to actually be able to put that together and into a format to communicate, because this again goes back to the whole communication piece and getting an understanding. And I, as a writer, for you to be able to put this together, can you did you talk to many families? Did you talk to many people? Like how did you sort of seed?
Well, in both cases, first of all, with eBaby, I had interviewed a woman when I went to Bangkok who had a surrogate, and I tried to get that story published, but Australian media wasn't interested because she wasn't Australian. And but the story stayed with me, and I wanted to explore the other side, sort of what that relationship was like, because it was the baby gammy era, and it was all, the focus wasn't on the relationship, and I really wanted to know how that relationship worked between an intended parent and a surrogate. So I spent a lot of time on YouTube, watching surrogates online, and so with eBaby it was just my own research, and but with D-Baby, by that time I'd connected with VARTA, which is the Victorian Assisted Reproduction Technology advocacy, the government group that actually regulates now how donor-conceived children find their parents or not. And so through them, I also, for D-Baby, I spoke to donor-conceived people and also sperm donors. But it was also through my own research. And when I was in Singapore doing that, I did E-Baby in the first half of Singapore, the first couple of years, and then I did D-Baby in the later years. I spent a lot of time online looking at even psychology videos, because one of the characters sees a psychologist. So I spent hours looking at all different sorts of psychology. So I basically went to the University of YouTube.
Yeah. Which we do, most of us regularly.
A lot, yeah. Jane, I just wanted to tap in on that too. As a producer, the interesting thing for me too is how can you translate that through those different cultures in different worlds? Because the restrictions of rules that we are governed under can be really diversive to somebody's emotional attachment to the story. So, in one country, surrogacy may be legal, in another it may not be, and then you enter that black market world. Did you get any feedback when it moved around, how people were translating it to suit their cultures?
Well, it's only really been produced in English-speaking countries. Spain hasn't happened yet. But I think because the main question I had was, because during the baby gammy era, the notion of surrogacy in India, Thailand and places like that was much more known. And so there was confusion about why I was focusing on the United States and why neither of my plays are set in Australia. So it was more sort of that cultural question that was raised with me. Why isn't it set here? Why do you have people doing an American accent, which costs money? But because I felt I couldn't get into the head of a Thai surrogate, I didn't know enough about them. And also, but mainly because in America, it's the Wild West of reproductive, assisted reproduction, and regulated, and they had the added problem of religion.
Yeah.
And religion adds another layer of conflict, internal conflict and drama characters. And I was really fascinated by how, particularly with E-Baby, which was really interesting to me when I did a lot of research about that, why many of the surrogates were Christians. And so I couldn't quite understand that until I realised that, and my interpretation is that for them it was an extension of being a good woman. It was the extension of this sort of notion that Mary carried a baby for God. And so this is something that is regarded as a noble cause. So that added a really much more dramatic layer of to the whole question of termination, all sorts of things. So therefore, for me, culturally, that was the question I was most asked in Australia. Why is it in America? Why isn't it here? But Australia doesn't have commercial surrogacy. No. So I just wanted to explore that and sort of point to it and say, look, this is what can happen here. Sort of, this is sheds a light on where we're going with this. So, but in terms of the other cultures and interpretations, because it was really a story about a relationship more than anything, you don't have to be interested in surrogacy or donor conception or anything to understand these plays. And in terms of most plays too, they might have an overarching story or theme, but they're both basically all plays and stories about relationships. And I think that's what resonated with people, the emotions that the characters were going through. So we didn't really have any sort of cultural issues in that way.
Okay. So Jane, where to now?
At the moment, I have a musical as well, a ukulele musical, and that was produced in...
I'm just going to say something. Our producer here is a ukulele fan. She has been really involved with the ukulele movement in Cairns, and a little while back, I wouldn't even know the year, it's quite a while now, but we had a I'll let Melissa say that basically we had a
Oh, yes, it was the challenge, the world challenge to have the most amount of people playing ukulele at any one time.
at one time, and it was done here in Cairns.
Yeah, and we kept chasing Japan. They kept winning.
They kept winning.
They dashed us by 100 people.
Yes, well, the ukulele musical was called Uked, the first play-along ukulele musical. And I started writing that in Singapore and finished it here because after surrogacy and donor conception, I wanted to write something fun. And in Singapore, I took up the ukulele because I played guitar originally, but I couldn't actually leave the apartment very often unless I was in air-conditioned taxis or air-conditioned restaurants and things because the humidity encouraged cellulitis, and I was in and out of hospital a lot there. And so I took up the ukulele and learned on YouTube, and then I wrote a play about it, about a woman who takes up the ukulele and learns on YouTube. and her name's Carla, and she's 50, and she's dumped on her 50th birthday by her violin-playing boyfriend, Brian. And to prove her musical worth and to find love, she takes up the ukulele and she joins a dating site. And you follow her journey of romantic and her ukulele learning, and people can play along. As she learns, the audience can play along. There's a screen with all the lyrics, and so the audience plays along. And also, when she joins a club, the audience members can register to be on stage with her as her fellow club members. So we had so there was a season. We did that in Guildford, which is about 10 minutes down the road from Castlemaine. And then it had another season in Newham, a tiny little place near Macedon. And it's been licensed by David Spicer Productions in Sydney for others to produce. And we have a friend of mine who's an actor in South Australia is hoping to do it there next year. And a couple of people in Auckland were going to do it last year, but that fizzled. COVID and sort of, I think it was a bit of a challenge for them too. It's quite complicated to produce. And
we're getting lots of movement and head nods and smiles out of our producer Melissa, and I'm thinking she needs to speak.
Oh yeah, I definitely believe that no one can be unhappy with a ukulele in their hand, and I encourage anybody with children to have them in the car.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, it's a perfect thing. But
it was amazing.
Yeah, we definitely have someone here that could play that role, I think. A couple of them, but the Uke Club here is huge, so we'll be talking about that after the show.
My people need to talk to your people.
Yeah.
It's interesting, Jane.
Forming
like
the community.
The connections that are being made over the series of this of our human experience has been
remarkable.
So remarkable.
Yeah.
We've had such divide in so many ways. Just our little countries have been our states with COVID and separation. And I think that this is just a beautiful way of us all coming back together.
It's great.
Yeah. So there's many layers of our human experience, and our intention is to connect others and bring some unity back into each other's lives in many ways.
And every interview has formulated a new connection and enhanced not just the knowledge that we've got from the people that we have interviewed, but just broadened that whole feeling that we are one country and we are all connected.
That's great.
Yeah.
Really great.
And I think too, it's about embracing our country of Australia, because prior to COVID, a lot of people would not travel within their own country and they would go overseas. And so I think this now has changed people's mindset, and they're traveling to places that potentially they've never been before. So all the ukulele players could all come for a holiday. Melissa, she's shaking her head.
Yeah.
The play could be performed.
I think we might have a movement, Jane, towards getting that play on up here, because we've got the support, we've got the ukulele players, and it just sounds like a terrific amount of fun.
Yeah.
Well, have a look at the Uked website. There's a Uked.
Melissa's been Googling already.
Yeah, so it is a great fun. It was a hoot.
And I have to mention, like, you have an amazing musical family that with your children, Jane. I just would love you to share, because I know, you know, you've given us an idea of where you're headed, but your children also have been encouraged and supported by you, like your mother did with you. And can you just tell us a little bit about your beautiful children, because they are musically talented, gifted, and I could go on, but I'm going to let you do that.
Well, at risk of embarrassing them,
No, don't worry about that.
my son, Johannes Lubers, he's about to, on the 7th, what date is it? I think it's the 5th. I've got to get the date right. He's launching his latest album at the Jazz Lab in Melbourne. And he's a composer, jazz musician and composer. And he's won many awards for his work, done brilliantly, and is just an amazing composer and musician and a very humble individual too. So looking forward to going to Melbourne soon and being part of that launch.
Sure.
And my daughter Greta, she studied classical voice at the Melbourne Conservatorium, but now she's also doing jazz. And she's, learning jazz vocals. But no, she's doing brilliantly in the jazz course there as well. And she spent the weekend here, and she's getting some gigs together to also perform. And she's performed up here a couple of times as well. She has a little trio called Greta et les Garçons, which is Greta and the Boys, because she does French jazz as well as Australian.
Nice.
Because she spent some time in France, didn't she?
Yes, she studied international politics in France at Sciences Po. And so she lived there she did her exchange there, and then she did a year there, I think. So she's lived a year in total in Paris, and she speaks French. And so and she came up here last weekend and trilled away all weekend. It was fantastic. So she's doing really well too. So they both are passionate musicians.
Lovely.
Well, you've definitely, I'm sure, been that encouraging mother to have them. That's another common thread, that we all need people to support us and encourage us with our creative ideas. And, creativity can be something that you don't discover sometimes until you're older, or sometimes, parents bring it out and encourage it as children. But I think that's been another common thread that we're finding, of creativity that's hidden away, but when you get around other creative people and they pick up on it and say, you've got the most incredible voice, or have you thought of doing this? And it's getting around people that will encourage and support. And it's like, this is part of our human experience. We're creating a community of support.
It's I think you have to be careful to be too encouraging.
That's not a bad thing.
No, honestly, I think that what Anna just touched on there, as a parent, you encourage your child to play whatever instrument they're playing, or whatever sporting thing that they're following, and you have those pushbacks from children, and then you tell them they can do this, and we'll there's a reward at the end, and there's years and years of bartering going on. And then as adults, they turn around and say, you know what, Mum, I'm really glad you did that, because now, I don't know, I'm a rock star or whatever it is. And so you get that lovely gift, but it's not in the immediate moment often.
It's a bit complicated because it was too important because of what it meant in the family. And so it's been a complicated thing, and people have my kids luckily have found that because of me and despite me.
And funnily enough, the last time I saw your children, we went roller skating in Newtown many years ago.
How old were you then?
Well, I was tinkering on Rebellion at 13.
Okay.
But where does time go, Jane? Where does time go?
I am so proud of you, Anna, and I know that that Jan is, and it's just you've had a remarkable journey as well. Have you been on this show?
Well, Melissa's actually interviewing me, so it's Thank you. I appreciate you saying that.
You too. It's just incredible, and really, you're the biggest winner.
Thank you. I have to share something with you. We had a guest in prior to you, and at the end of her interview, she shared something with me that it was life-changing. But she had a health problem, a weight problem in her life, and I didn't even know this before we invited her on, and she said that how much I inspired her, and she watched me and she followed me, and she then followed things that I was doing, and she lost 25 kilos, and she was on the verge of having her foot amputated, and I helped save her foot.
That's just amazing.
I was just, I've had actually a life-changing day, and and having you on, and things are just formulating, and I think that's when everyone's best work is done, when it just formulates without having to push it. And being in that corporate space, I'm pleasurably saying that I'm not driving in that corporate area at the moment. I'm taking a back seat from it and going into the areas of a little bit more pleasure, where I think better work can be done, not just for myself, but for other people. But I have to throw in encouragement. When Claire was mentioning about encouraging children with music and creativity, I had a mother that did that. Yeah. And it's very interesting because she had paint sets for me with Derwent paints and pens and pencils, sorry. Yep. I had clarinet lessons, and she bribed me for gelati in Rathdown Street. And she did a lot of that, and all I wanted to do was handstand. And it's really funny because what is Anna still doing now? Handstanding. So but I can play the clarinet.
But she did encourage your creativity, which whatever medium you ended up choosing, creativity is still part of.
But that's what I mean.
The development.
Because it's interesting, what our parents see with their potential. Mum has seen, but didn't know how to control me in a way, very energetic.
We often sort of, when we don't know who our child is, and that comes out, and we try and find that the child has to find themselves. But my mother wanted me to be the great Australian artist. She bought me paints and encouraged that as well, and so she didn't. She sort of encouraged me to be a writer in that she bought me books, and she encouraged me to contact Alan Marshall, who I was one of the childhood pen pals of Alan Marshall, who wrote I Can Jump novels. Yeah. But ultimately, she would have preferred, I think, that I was an artist. She used to say to me when she sort of reconciled the fact that I was going to write, after 30 years of being a journalist, she said, I thought you'd write something someday, because she meant the great Australian novel.
Well, Jane, all I can say is it's still a possibility that you could write that novel.
No, I'm writing the memoir instead.
Okay. There we go.
Her.
Thank you so much for taking time out today, Jane, to come on Our Human Experience.
Yeah, it's lovely.
We would love you to let our listeners know how they can touch base with you through the land of social media. Would you be able to let our listeners know how they can do that?
I'm on Facebook and occasionally on Twitter, and I'm on Instagram, but most of my Instagram pictures are of my husband's garden, because I've been writing my memoir. I've been in my bunker for the whole and I'm about to emerge when that's done. So, yes, so find me on Facebook, or I have a website, janecafarella.com.au, and the Ute website, ute.com.au.
Lovely. Fantastic. We'll get all those details and pop that up together with your podcast when we launch. And I think I did mention before, if your children are quite happy to have a little link attached to their mother's podcast, and we might be able to sort of give them a bit of a plug as well, because you're all part of one family.
That'd be great. Thank you so much, Anna and Claire. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks for coming on board.
Thank you for listening to Our Human Experience. You can follow us on social media on Instagram and Facebook.
ourhumanexperience.com.au.
Listen to Our Human Experience, where you can pod binge anytime you like. See you next time.
Bye.
If you have found this episode to cause you some distress, please reach out to a friend or call Lifeline anytime on 131114. Take care.